They were brothers in ministry, two giants who once stood side by side, shaping the soul of modern Black Christianity. But what if I told you that behind their public smiles and fiery sermons, T.D. Jakes was hiding 5 secrets, 5 truths he never revealed to Bishop Eddie Long, not even when the world turned against them both? At 67, Bishop Jakes has finally broken his silence, and what he confessed has left the entire church world stunned. For years, T.D. Jakes and Bishop Eddie Long were seen as 2 pillars of faith, powerful voices who carried the weight of an entire generation of believers. Their ministries changed lives, inspired millions, and transformed how the world viewed the modern Black church. But behind the sermons, the cameras, and the applause, there were conversations that never made it to the pulpit, secrets that were buried deep, covered by loyalty, silence, and pain. Now, as Bishop Jakes reflects at 67, he's speaking from a place of wisdom, loss, undeniable truth. He's finally ready to talk about the 5 secrets he carried in silence, things he kept hidden from his late friend, Bishop Eddie Long. And these secrets don't just expose a personal journey, they uncover a hidden side of the megachurch era, the price of leadership, and the emotional toll that even the strongest pastors quietly endure. Because here's the thing, fame in ministry isn't just about preaching the word, it's about surviving the spotlight. And few knew that better than Jakes and Long. They were more than pastors, they were icons, both celebrated and criticized. But while Eddie Long's scandals made headlines, the private truths T.D. Jakes carried remained unspoken. Until now. What were these secrets? Why did Jakes choose to keep them buried for so long? And what finally made him reveal them now, decades later? Stay with me because what you're about to hear might forever change the way you see both of these men. Behind every brotherhood, there's an unspoken rivalry, and in the world of megachurch leadership, that silent tension can be overwhelming. While the public saw T. Jakes and Bishop Eddie Long as inseparable allies, the truth is, both men quietly battled the weight of comparison. When Bishop Long's New Birth Missionary Baptist Church began drawing national attention in the late 1990 seconds, filling arenas and captivating the media, whispers in the church world grew louder. People began asking, who's the real voice of modern ministry, Jakes or Long? And though Jakes would publicly honor his friend behind closed doors, that question stung. It wasn't jealousy, it was something deeper. A struggle between admiration and insecurity. T.D. Jakes has since admitted that the ministry world often forces leaders to wear masks of confidence, even when they're breaking inside. He once hinted in an interview that one of his greatest regrets was allowing the pressure of comparison to rob him of pure friendship. You see, Jakes and Long both carried different visions. Jakes focused on emotional healing, while Long preached empowerment and authority. But the more their ministries grew, the more the world pushed them into invisible competition. Every conference, every sermon, every headline became a subtle scoreboard. And here's where the first secret lies. Jakes never told Eddie that he often felt overshadowed during their early years of friendship. He kept his insecurities hidden behind encouragement, offering support while quietly wrestling with doubt. He once said, the moment you start comparing your calling to another man's gift, you lose sight of your own anointing. That realization came too late. Because by the time both pastors reached their peak, the quiet rivalry had already reshaped their friendship into something polite, distant, and cautious. But what happened next changed everything. When Eddie Long's public battles began, Jakes faced a moral dilemma that would test his loyalty and his faith more than ever before. When scandal struck Bishop Eddie Long in 2010, the world watched as headlines turned his name from celebrated pastor to public controversy overnight. The accusations, the lawsuits, the interviews, they didn't just shake New Birth Church, they shook the foundation of the entire faith community. For T.D. Jakes, that moment wasn't just heartbreaking, it was paralyzing. Eddie wasn't just another pastor, he was a friend, a brother in the ministry, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him when no one else would. They had shared stages, laughter, and spiritual victories. But when the fire came, Jakes found himself at a crossroads stand, publicly beside his friend, and risk his own reputation, or stay silent and let the storm pass. And he chose silence. In the years that followed, that silence became one of the heaviest burdens of his life. Sources close to Jakes have said that he often looked back at that time with a sense of emotional conflict, torn between protecting the empire he had built and honoring the brotherhood they once shared. He later spoke vaguely about it during a sermon, saying, "Sometimes God allows the storm to expose who's really standing with you." It was one of those moments that hit differently because those who knew their history could hear the pain between the lines. Behind the scenes, Jakes did reach out privately. He called Eddie, they prayed, they cried, but Jakes never made that public defense, not on camera, not on stage. And for Eddie Long, who faced isolation and humiliation, that absence was louder than words. Friends close to both pastors later revealed that Jakes wrestled with guilt. He once said to a confidant, "It's easy to preach loyalty until loyalty costs you something." And for Jakes, that cost was reputation, something he couldn't afford to lose at the height of his influence. This was the second secret. Not a scandal, but a silence. A silence that haunted him for years. Jakes carried that regret quietly, and when Bishop Eddie Long passed away in 2017, it left an unfinished chapter between two men who once dreamed of changing the world together. During Long's funeral, Jakes' face told a story words could not. Many noticed that his voice trembled, that he paused longer than usual before speaking. Insiders say he later confessed that his tears weren't just for Eddie's death, they were for the conversations they never had, for the apologies that would never be spoken. Because behind the grandeur of the pulpit lies a simple truth. Pastors are human too. They bleed, they doubt, they fail, and sometimes they stay silent when they should have spoken. But the story doesn't end there, because in the years after Long's passing, T.D. Jakes would uncover something about his own ministry, a revelation that would change his understanding of success, faith, and calling forever. And that leads us to the third secret one that reveals what Bishop Jakes discovered in his most private moments, long after the crowds went home. To the world, T.D. Jakes is the picture of strength, the man who never breaks. He preaches powerfully, leads confidently, and carries himself like a man who has conquered every challenge. But what most people never knew was that behind those commanding sermons and million-view broadcasts, there was a man quietly unraveling. After Bishop Eddie Long's passing in 2017, something inside Jakes shifted. For years, he had buried himself in ministry work conferences, movie deals, book tours, interviews. From the outside, it looked like he was thriving. But privately, he was exhausted. His body was there on stage, but his soul was running on fumes. He later admitted in a quiet interview that there were seasons when he questioned everything, his calling, his purpose, even his identity beyond the pulpit. It's possible, he said, to be celebrated publicly and still feel unseen privately. And that was his third secret, the hidden weight of the mantle. For T.D., Jakes' ministry wasn't just a calling, it was a constant test of endurance. Every sermon was an expectation. Every headline was a reminder that one wrong move could destroy everything he had built. After Eddie's fall from grace, Jakes became hyper-aware of how fragile a leader's reputation could be. He started guarding himself, watching his words, his image, even his friendships. He became cautious not just in ministry, but in relationships. He once said, "In this world, your vulnerability can become someone else's content." And that's exactly how he began living. Armored, distant, cautious. But that armor came at a price. Behind the lights, Jakes struggled with what he later called the loneliness of leadership. He confessed that the higher you climb, the smaller your circle becomes. "Everybody wants to eat at your table," he said, "but few want to help you carry the weight that built it." That loneliness grew heavier after Eddie Long's passing, because no one understood the journey the way Eddie did. They came from the same generation, both rose from humble beginnings, both faced rejection from traditional church leaders, both built empires from nothing, and now one was gone, and the other was left carrying both of their legacies. For years, Jakes didn't talk about it, but those close to him noticed the changes. He became more introspective in his sermons. His tone softened. The fire was still there, but it burned differently, slower, deeper, almost mournful. It was as if he was preaching not to a crowd anymore, but to his own heart. That's when he began focusing more on legacy and less on fame. He started pouring into his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, preparing her to take on a mantle that he now realized was heavier than anyone could imagine. And it was in this season of quiet reflection that he discovered something startling, a truth about himself that not even Eddie Long had known. A truth about the emotional cost of anointing and the sacrifices hidden behind his success. Because every pastor has two ministries, the one people see and the one they survive in silence. But what Jakes revealed next took everyone by surprise, not about his friend, but about his own struggles with identity, forgiveness, and the scars that fame could not heal. There are certain words that weigh heavier when they're never spoken. And for Bishop T.D. Jakes, the word forgiveness became a silent echo that followed him for years. Not forgiveness from others, but forgiveness toward himself. After Bishop Eddie Long's passing, Jakes was left with unfinished conversations that replayed in his mind like an old film he couldn't turn off. The things he wanted to say, the things he didn't say, the moments when he could have stood closer, and the moments when distance felt easier than confrontation. He once said in a private interview, "It's not the things you said that haunt you, it's the things you never said." And that was the truth. Jakes had forgiven Eddie Long years before he passed, but he had never told him. Why? Because the world was too loud and both men were too proud. During the height of Long's controversy, there were private meetings among church leaders, phone calls, strategy sessions, hushed conversations about how to handle the scandal. Many chose to cut ties. Some chose to wait it out. But Jakes? He chose silence. Not because he agreed with the accusations or believed the rumors, but because he didn't know how to show grace without being judged for it. Years later, he revealed to a close circle that he carried guilt for not being more public with his forgiveness. "I should have said it to his face," he confessed. "Not for him, but for me, because I needed to release the weight I'd been carrying." He began preaching more about grace after that, not the kind that's just spoken from the pulpit, but the kind that hurts. The kind that forces you to look at your own hypocrisy, your own silence, your own refusal to show compassion when it cost you something. He said in one sermon, almost cryptically, "If grace doesn't make you uncomfortable, you haven't experienced it yet." Many who knew the backstory believed that was his way of publicly repenting, not for sin, but for pride. For letting image and expectation become a wall between him and a friend who desperately needed his hand. It was in that season that Jakes began reaching out quietly to others who had fallen, pastors who'd been rejected, leaders who'd lost their way. He began mentoring them privately, not for the cameras, but for redemption, because in forgiving them, he was really forgiving himself. That's when something shifted in his preaching. The fire was still there, but now it burned through compassion. His words became less about victory and more about vulnerability. He started reminding people that your fall doesn't disqualify you, it reveals who's willing to help you stand again. Behind the scenes, those close to Jakes say he often talked about Eddie Long's final years with deep sorrow and gratitude. He knew Eddie wasn't perfect, none of them were, but he also knew that what destroyed Eddie wasn't just sin or scandal, it was isolation, the loneliness of carrying guilt without grace. And that's what broke Jakes' heart the most, because he understood it, he had felt it, and he had almost fallen into it himself. When he finally shared this story publicly years later, many were shocked by his honesty. He said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean you were wrong to feel hurt, it means you're brave enough to let healing have the last word." And in that moment, you could tell. He wasn't just talking to the congregation, he was talking to Eddie. That was the fourth secret, the forgiveness he never spoke aloud. The quiet reconciliation between two souls who had drifted apart in life but found peace in eternity. But what Jakes revealed next, his fifth and final secret, wasn't about Eddie Long at all. It was about himself, the man behind the ministry. The truth about what he almost lost while trying to hold the world together. And this last revelation might be his most powerful one yet. For decades, Bishop T.D. Jakes was the face of strength, faith, and unstoppable resilience. The world saw the conferences, the crowds, the best-selling books, and the endless charisma that seemed larger than life. But what no one knew, not even Bishop Eddie Long, was that there was a moment when Jakes nearly walked away from it all. It happened in a quiet season after Eddie's passing, when Jakes was deep in reflection and battling exhaustion that no one could see. The megachurch was thriving, his films were winning awards, and his books were topping charts, yet every morning felt heavier than the last. He described it once in a rare interview as a kind of emptiness success can't fix. He was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. He had become the answer to everyone's problems, but had no one to answer his own. The phone never stopped ringing, the demands never stopped coming, and slowly, the man who had once found joy in preaching began to lose his connection to the very thing that gave him purpose. Late one night, while sitting alone in his study, Jake said he heard a still, quiet voice, the kind that doesn't come from outside, but from deep within. That voice asked him one question. If you weren't Bishop T.D. Jakes, would you still know who you are? He didn't have an answer, and that realization broke him. He had spent so many years building the Potter's House, mentoring leaders, writing books, appearing on television, yet he couldn't remember the last time he felt peace. Not happiness, not applause, just peace. That night, he seriously considered stepping away from ministry. He even told his wife, Sarita, I think I've poured out so much that there's nothing left of me to give. But she reminded him of something he had once said on stage years before a line that had inspired millions. You can't pour from an empty cup, but you can let God fill it again. Those words, his own words, saved him. He realized that what he was facing wasn't burnout, it was transformation. God wasn't ending his ministry, he was renewing it. The pain, the guilt, the loss of Eddie Long, the silence, the self-doubt, it was all part of a refining process. A breaking before a new beginning. So instead of quitting, T.D. Jakes did something unexpected. He reinvented his calling. He started focusing less on building a platform and more on building people. He began grooming the next generation of leaders, especially his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts. He wanted to make sure that when he finally stepped down, the ministry wouldn't die with him, but live through legacy. He also began openly discussing mental health and emotional exhaustion among pastors, something rarely addressed in the church world. He spoke about therapy, rest, and the dangers of confusing purpose with performance. If you only feel valuable when you're busy, he said, you're already in danger of losing yourself. That transparency shocked many, but it also healed thousands. For the first time, people saw the man behind the message. And they connected with him not as a bishop, but as a human being who had felt pain, regret, and renewal. And that was the fifth secret the night T. D. Jakes almost gave up on his calling, and how that moment of weakness became the foundation of his greatest strength.